Just as the American Civil War was finally ending, an overcrowded Mississippi River steamboat suffered a catastrophic boiler explosion. More people died in this disaster than on the Titanic, yet it has been largely forgotten by history. What would you do if you found yourself trapped in a situation where you had survived 4 brutal years of Civil War prison camps, only to be ripped apart by an exploding boiler in the final hours of your journey home? To truly understand this national tragedy, we have to look back at the historical records of April 1865. The American Civil War was grinding to a bloody, exhausted halt. The Confederacy was collapsing, and Union soldiers who had survived the absolute unspeakable horrors of notorious Confederate prison camps like Andersonville and Cahaba were finally released. They were desperate, so desperate to see their families eat a warm, home-cooked meal and sleep in their own beds. The port of Vicksburg, Mississippi was a chaotic, mud-soaked labyrinth of exhausted men, shouting officers, and steam-belching paddle steamers. How many men could a single wooden boat safely carry? The legal capacity of the Sultana, a side-wheel steam packet built for commercial cargo and a modest number of passengers, was set at a strict 376 people. Yet, on the sultry afternoon of April 24, 1865, corruption, greed, and military bribery overrode all common sense. Over 2,000 Union soldiers were crammed onto the decks like cattle. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, tier upon tier, so tightly that the wooden decks sagged dangerously under the immense human weight, and the boat listed heavily to one side. The captain and local steamboat agents were paid a handsome fee per soldier by the Union Army, incentivizing them to pack every square inch of the vessel until she could breathe no more. Among the crush of humanity were men broken by starvation, disease, and the psychological trauma of war. Yet, despite the miserable overcrowding, the atmosphere on board was electric with overwhelming relief. Men laughed, shared stories of home, and sang songs as the massive paddle wheels began to churn the muddy brown waters of the Mississippi River. They were heading north. They were going home. But the Sultana was already a ticking time bomb before she even left the dock. Days earlier, while docked in Vicksburg, one of the massive copper boilers had begun to bulge and fracture under intense pressure due to a dangerous buildup of scale and sediment. A responsible captain would have laid over for a day or two to have the boiler properly replaced or welded. Instead, driven by the sheer greed of maximizing passenger bounties, a quick, cheap, temporary patch job was slapped onto the cracked metal, just enough to pass a superficial inspection and get the boat moving. A fatal shortcut, a ticking disaster. As the overloaded steamboat chugged northward against the fierce, swollen spring currents of the Mississippi, the strain on the patched boiler intensified to a horrific degree. The river was swollen from heavy spring rains and melting snow, forcing the engines to work twice as hard just to make headway against the rushing brown torrent. It was the dead of night. The date was April 27, 1865, roughly 2 o'clock in the morning. Most of the exhausted soldiers were fast asleep, packed shoulder to shoulder across the open decks and narrow corridors, dreaming of their families and warm beds. Total silence blanketed the dark river, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of the massive paddle wheels and the hiss of steam. Without warning, the night was torn apart by a cataclysmic, deafening roar. Boom! The patched boiler ruptured with such violent force that it tore through the upper decks like a missile, obliterating the captain's quarters, the social hall, and the wooden smokestacks. Tons of scalding, high-pressure steam and boiling water blasted horizontally across the crowded decks, instantly cooking hundreds of sleeping soldiers alive in their tracks. A wall of white-hot fire erupted from the core of the ship, igniting the dry wooden superstructure into an inferno within seconds. Can you imagine the absolute terror? Waking up in pitch-black darkness, blinded by blinding steam, choking on smoke, and surrounded by screaming men as the wooden floorboards beneath you turned into a raging wall of flames. The sheer chaos of the explosion threw hundreds of sleeping men violently into the freezing, churning current of the Mississippi River. Those who managed to escape the immediate blast zone found themselves trapped on a burning, sinking hulk, drifting helplessly down the dark river. The weight of the survivors caused the ship to list uncontrollably, feeding the hungry flames that licked higher into the midnight sky. Panic turned the deck into a nightmare of human desperation. Men fought frantically for life jackets that were mostly cheap fakes, stuffed with useless, waterlogged bulrushes instead of cork. Soldiers leaped blindly from the burning railings into the dark, swirling water below, hoping against hope that they could swim to safety. But for many, the freezing river current was just as lethal as the fire. Exhausted from years of prison camp starvation, their frail bodies could barely stay afloat against the powerful, muddy undertow of the swollen spring river. As the Sultana burned fiercely against the dark backdrop of the Tennessee shore near Memphis, word of the disaster began to spread through the night air like wildfire. Despite the profound national grief still lingering across America over the recent assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, who had been killed just weeks earlier, the tragedy of the Sultana slipped quietly through the cracks of a distracted history. Yet human compassion shone brightly in the darkest hours. Rescue boats, local citizens, and even Confederate sympathizers from the riverbanks rushed out in small skiffs and makeshift rafts to pull freezing, burned survivors from the water, saving hundreds of lives against overwhelming odds. Can you imagine the bittersweet agony? Surviving 4 years of Civil War prison camps, only to be torn apart by an exploding boiler in the final hours of the journey home. Yet trapped beneath that national tragedy, stories of incredible heroism and survival emerged from the ashes. Men clung to floating pieces of broken wood, wooden doors, and heavy cargo bales for hours in the freezing dark, refusing to let go of life when everything else had been stripped away. Their will was stronger than the river. In the days that followed, the true scale of the horror became undeniable. When the final headcounts were tallied, an estimated 1,168 people lost their lives, surpassing the death toll of the Titanic disaster nearly half a century later. Yet because the nation was exhausted by war and mourning its fallen president, accountability vanished into the bureaucratic ether. Weeks turned into months as the shocking details of government corruption, military bribery, corporate greed, and cover-ups slowly came to light, though no one was ever truly held accountable for the disaster. The river washed away the charred wreckage, and time slowly buried the memory of the dead. To this day, the Sultana remains the greatest maritime disaster in American history, a haunting reminder of what happens when human greed overrides human life. In a single night, a generation of survivors vanished into the dark waters, leaving behind only open currents, whispering winds, and a legacy that time should never have allowed to sink.